There's a metal toolbox that used to sit under my father's workbench, dented on one corner from where it fell off a truck bed back in 1991. And for a while, I thought my brother had already thrown it in a dumpster along with the rest of my father's life. He almost did. Before I go any further, let me tell you where this ends up. By the time this story is over, my brother was sitting in a folding chair in a federal courthouse hallway in handcuffs, his wife 2 seats down, refusing to even look at him, and I was standing in the gravel lot of the company my father built, holding keys to land that had my name on the trust documents the entire time. He never told me that while he was alive. Somebody else had to tell me, and only because I pulled that dented toolbox out of a dumpster with my own hands the night after his funeral, and read the last page of an old ledger by lamplight until the coffee in front of me went stone cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the people who show up to help you are not always the ones who loved you the longest. My name is Denise Calloway, and for 12 years I ran my father's roofing company. Not in the sense of holding a title, though eventually I held plenty of titles nobody printed on a business card. I ran it the way you run something you built with your own 2 hands, even when your name isn't on the sign out front, even when the checks come from an account you don't own. My father, Walter Calloway, started Calloway Roofing and Sheet Metal in 1978 with 1 truck, a used extension ladder, and a line of credit from a small local bank that got swallowed up by a regional chain sometime in the 90s and doesn't exist anymore under that name. My mother, Alina, kept the books at the kitchen table for the first decade, longhand ledgers, and a manual adding machine that chewed through ribbon faster than my father could buy it. And when she got sick right around when I turned 19 and died 2 years after that, I was the one who slid into her chair at that same kitchen table, because somebody had to, and my brother Kyle was 22 years old and had never once in his life balanced a checkbook. I want to be specific about what 12 years of running that company actually looked like, because the specifics matter later. They matter more than almost anything else in this story. I started as the girl who answered phones and scheduled crews around rain delays, sitting at a metal desk in a double-wide trailer that served as our office, a space heater at my feet in the winter, and a box fan blowing hot air at my face in the summer, because the AC unit was always the last thing my father would spend money to fix. I remember one August so brutal that the thermometer nailed to the outside of the trailer read 104 in the shade, and I sat at that desk with a wet bandana around my neck, taking calls from panicked property managers whose flat roofs were bubbling in the heat. And I never once complained out loud, because complaining wasn't something my father had much patience for, and somewhere along the way I absorbed that same lack of patience for my own complaints too. Within 4 years, I had my OSHA 30 certification, sitting through the classroom hours on my own time on weekends, driving 45 minutes each way to a community college annex that offered the course twice a year. And I was writing estimates directly off blueprints for commercial tear-offs, translating architect drawings into square footage, into labor hours, into dumpster loads. I understood the difference between a modified bitumen system and a fully adhered TPO membrane better than half the manufacturer reps who came through trying to sell us material, because I had actually stood on both kinds of roofs in 95-degree heat watching crews, torch down seams, and roll white membrane, not just read a spec sheet in an air-conditioned office somewhere. I remember the first time I corrected a manufacturer rep in front of my father, gently, over a coverage rate he'd misquoted on a 50-square job, and the way my father didn't say a word in that meeting, but bought me a coffee afterward without being asked, which was as close to a standing ovation as that man ever gave anybody. I learned wind uplift ratings, the difference between a 60 and a 90-pound per square foot rating on a coastal job, because getting that wrong meant a roof that peeled off in the first tropical storm and a lawsuit that could sink a company our size. I learned NOA requirements, notice of acceptance numbers, for every job we bid within 100 miles of the coast, because building departments there would reject a permit application in a heartbeat if the product approval numbers didn't match what the code required for that wind zone. I kept a 3-ring binder, color-coded by manufacturer, with every current NOA letter we might need for an inspector, because I had watched, early on, a competitor lose an entire job to a stop work order over exactly that kind of paperwork failure, And I never wanted to be the company standing on a job site explaining to an inspector why we couldn't produce the right letter. I got us our GAF Master Elite certification, which took nearly 2 years of paperwork, safety audits, and factory training sessions most small outfits never bother pursuing because it's expensive and tedious and doesn't pay off immediately. But it let us bid jobs that came with manufacturer-backed extended warranties, the kind property managers and general contractors specifically require in their bid packages, and that certification alone was the single biggest lever that took us from being a residential outfit scraping by on roofs to a company that could sit at the table with real commercial clients. I remember the factory training week itself, 3 days in a training center 2 states away, sitting in a classroom full of men twice my age from other companies, most of them assuming I was somebody's office assistant tagging along, until I started asking questions about tear-off sequencing on multiply systems that made the instructor stop and actually look at me for the first time. I did the payroll every single week for a workforce that, at its peak, numbered around 60 men across 11 crews. I did the job costing, which meant I knew, down to the dollar, what a 40-square tear-off and re-roof actually cost us in labor hours, material waste factor, dump fees, and equipment rental, and I knew what we needed to bid above that cost to keep a healthy margin after overhead, insurance, and the owner's draw. I built a spreadsheet system, before most small contractors our size had moved off paper entirely, that tracked committed costs against actual costs on every single job in progress. So we could catch a job bleeding money in week 2, instead of discovering it, in a final reconciliation 3 months after the fact when there was nothing left to do about it. I tracked our experience modification rate, our EMR, for workers' compensation insurance, because I understood that one bad year of injuries could tank our premiums for 3 straight years afterward. So I made sure our toolbox talks and safety meetings weren't just a box we checked to satisfy an insurance auditor. They were real conversations about fall protection anchors and ladder angles and heat illness in July. I personally walked every single new crew leader through our fall protection plan before they were allowed to run a job independently, standing with them at the edge of a roof pointing out anchor points, because I had been to exactly one funeral for a man who fell off a roof on somebody else's crew before he ever worked for us, and I never wanted to stand at another one that I could have prevented with a harness and an anchor bolt. I negotiated our surety bond renewals every year with an agent named Phil Restrepo, who I probably talked to more often than I talked to most of my own friends, because a bonding company reviews your financial statements, your work-in-progress schedule, and your bank references before deciding how much capacity they'll extend you. And losing that capacity means losing the ability to bid anything that requires a payment and performance bond, which is most real commercial work. Phil used to joke that our file was the cleanest one on his desk, that he wished every contractor he worked with kept their receivables aging report as tight as I kept ours, and I never told him how many nights that tight aging report actually cost me, calling slow-paying clients personally at 8 in the morning before they could dodge me for the rest of the day. I built relationships with property managers and general contractors over the better part of a decade. The kind of relationships where they called me directly on my cell phone instead of putting a job out to competitive bid, because they had learned, job after job, that a Callaway crew would not leave a building open to the sky overnight in a rainstorm, would not walk off a project halfway through because a bigger check showed up somewhere else, would not pad a change order just because they could. Those relationships are not built in a quarter or a year. They are built in decade-long increments, one punch list closed out on time after another, one emergency tarp job at 2 in the morning after another, until your name becomes shorthand in someone's phone contacts for the word reliable. I remember one January ice storm, where I personally drove out at 4 in the morning, with 2 crew leads to tarp a partially torn-off roof on a shopping plaza before the interior sustained water damage, standing in freezing rain holding a flashlight so the guys could see the fasteners. And the property manager who called me sobbing with relief the next morning became one of our steadiest accounts for the next 6 years because of that single night. I did all of this on a modest salary that my father set, unilaterally, once a year, and never once asked me if it should be higher, and I never once asked him either, because that wasn't the water our family swam in. I drove a 10-year-old Silverado with 200,000 miles on it, the seats cracked from sun exposure, a company magnet on the door that I'd stopped bothering to peel off even on weekends. I lived in a small 2-bedroom rental 2 towns over, the second bedroom used mostly for filing boxes I brought home to work on at night, because I put every spare dollar back into either the business or, later, into a modest retirement account I was quietly building for a future that felt very far away and, frankly, theoretical. I remember a coworker once asking me, half joking, why the woman who basically ran the company still drove a truck with a check engine light that had been on for 2 years, and I laughed it off, telling her the truck still ran fine, when the honest answer was that I had simply never once given myself permission to think I deserved better than what I already had. I never married. There was a man once, Tom Brennan, a project manager for one of our biggest general contractor clients, and we dated for almost 3 years, good years honestly, the kind where you start picturing the rest of your life without quite saying it out loud. He asked me more than once, gently at first, and then with a little more edge as the years went on, why I was still living like I made half of what I actually made, why I hadn't bought a house of my own, why every vacation we planned got shortened or canceled because a job needed me on site. I remember one specific trip, a long weekend in the mountains we'd planned for almost a year, that I cut short by 2 full days because a wind event tore the membrane off a distribution warehouse, and there was nobody else who could handle the insurance adjuster's walk-through. And I remember the particular quiet in the car on the drive home, Tom's hands tight on the wheel, both of us understanding something neither one of us was ready to say out loud yet. I never had a good answer for him beyond the fact that saving, sacrificing, putting the business and the family first, was just what we did. It was the water we swam in, and I honestly could not picture a version of myself that didn't operate that way. Eventually he got tired of swimming in it alone, and he told me, not cruelly, just plainly, sitting across from me at a diner we used to go to on Sunday mornings, that he didn't think I was ever going to choose anything over that company, including him, and he was probably right. I didn't fight for it the way I should have. I barely had time to properly mourn it, if I'm honest, because that same year we landed the Bristow Commercial Group contract, the single biggest account in the company's 40-year history, and I was buried in it within weeks. Bristow Commercial Group managed a portfolio of retail plazas and office parks spread across 3 counties, dozens of properties, and getting onto their approved vendor list took me 8 months of relationship building, competitive bids on smaller jobs to prove ourselves, and a mountain of paperwork proving our bonding capacity, our insurance coverage, our safety record. I remember sitting up until nearly midnight 3 separate nights compiling that vendor application packet, cross-referencing our insurance certificates against their specific coverage minimums, formatting our safety statistics into the exact template their risk management department required, because I understood that a single missing document could knock us out of consideration before anyone ever looked at our actual work. Once we were in, it was steady, high-volume, portfolio-based work, the kind that smooths out your cash flow across the year because you're not chasing single jobs one at a time. You're servicing an entire book of properties on a rolling schedule, tear-offs in the dry season, emergency leak calls year-round. Their VP of Capital Projects, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Meredith Chen, became someone I spoke with almost weekly, sometimes daily during storm season. She used to tell me, half joking over coffee at a job site trailer, that she trusted my word over most contractors' signed contracts, because in 8 years of working together, I had never once told her a completion date I didn't hit, rain delays and all. I remember one late-night storm season phone call, Meredith's voice tight with stress over a leak flooding a tenant's retail space, and I talked her through exactly what our emergency crew could and couldn't do before daylight. And by the time we hung up, she said, quietly, that she didn't know what she'd do without someone on the other end of that phone who actually knew what they were talking about instead of just telling her what she wanted to hear. My brother Kyle, meanwhile, 4 years younger than me, spent those same 12 years doing what my father, in the kindest possible framing he could manage, called finding himself. Kyle was smart, genuinely sharp in conversation, quick with numbers when he bothered to sit still long enough to use them, the kind of smart that makes you angrier about the waste of it than you'd ever be about plain stupidity. He went to college for 2 years studying business, of all things, and dropped out midway through his sophomore year with no real explanation beyond restlessness. He worked for the company on and off after that, mostly off, showing up late to job sites smelling like the night before, missing entire weeks with vague explanations, and my father paid for rehab twice, once when Kyle was 26 and once when he was 31, both times quietly, both times without a word to me about the actual cost, until years later when I found the canceled checks doing the books. I remember specifically, the winter Kyle was supposed to run a small residential crew on his own for the first time. My father's quiet test to see if he could handle even a scaled-down version of responsibility. And how within the first week 2 separate homeowners called the office directly to complain that nobody had shown up on the scheduled day. And I had to quietly reroute one of my own crews to cover the job, so we wouldn't lose the client entirely, never once mentioning it to my father, because I'd already learned by then that mentioning Kyle's failures out loud accomplished nothing except making the next holiday dinner more uncomfortable. In between those stretches, Kyle lived off an allowance my father called a salary, tied to a job title, estimator, that mostly consisted of Kyle showing up to the office 2 or 3 days a week to sit in on meetings he rarely contributed anything meaningful to, checking his phone under the table, leaving early on Fridays. I want to be fair here because it matters to the shape of everything that follows. I loved my brother. I still, somewhere underneath everything that happened later, loved the idea of the brother he could have been if anyone had ever made him face a consequence that stuck. But I watched my father cover for him for over a decade. I watched him make excuses at Thanksgiving dinners when Kyle didn't show up at all, telling relatives Kyle was working a job out of town when I knew for a fact there was no job. I watched him quietly pay off a DUI attorney, a wrecked truck that Kyle totaled on a back road at 2 a.m, 2 rounds of rehab, and a handful of smaller debts I only ever glimpsed in the corner of the books, and I told myself none of it mattered, because I knew, the way you know the sun is going to rise in the east, that the company was mine. Not on paper, but in every single way that actually counted day to day. My father used to call me his right hand at job sites, in front of clients, in front of crews, and it wasn't a throwaway line. He meant it, and everyone who heard him say it understood exactly what he meant by it. When people asked, at industry association dinners or supplier golf outings, who was going to take over Callaway Roofing someday, my father would say without hesitation, "Denise already runs it, she just doesn't have the title yet." I heard him say some version of that sentence probably 24 times over the years, to bankers, to bonding agents, to our biggest clients, and I believed him completely every single time. That's the part that still gets me, even now, even after everything. I believed him completely, right up until the night I found out that belief had never been the whole story he was telling himself. My father was, in every sense that mattered, the quiet architect of everything our family had. He wasn't a warm man in the way you see fathers portrayed on television, all easy hugs and I love yous. He didn't hug easily. He said I love you maybe a handful of times a year, usually at the end of a phone call, almost as an afterthought, and I learned early to hear the weight in the ordinary things instead. The way he'd hand me the keys to the good truck without asking. The way he'd introduce me to a new client with my full title even before I officially had one. He built something out of nothing, a single used truck into a company with 11 crews and a shop on 4 acres of commercial land. And he did it through a kind of stubborn, unglamorous, daily discipline that I inherited whether I wanted to or not, whether anyone ever thanked me for it or not. He taught me to read a roof, the way other fathers teach their kids to read box scores, standing beside me on hot shingles pointing out where flashing had failed, where a previous crew had cut corners on a valley, where ponding water had slowly rotted a deck from underneath without ever showing on the surface. He taught me that a company's real health isn't in the revenue number on the top line of an income statement. It's in the aging report, in how fast you're actually collecting what clients owe you, in whether your crews are getting hurt on the job, in whether your equipment is properly maintained or held together with hope and duct tape. I thought, for 12 years, that all of that made me his heir in every way that mattered, in every way except the piece of paper, and I told myself the piece of paper would come eventually, when he was ready, when he felt like making it official instead of just true. I was wrong about exactly one thing, and it cost me everything I thought I understood about my father, right up until the moment I found out it hadn't cost me a single thing after all. The retirement dinner happened on a Friday night in October, at a banquet hall my father rented out for the occasion. 40 guests, including employees who'd been with him 20 years or more, a handful of our biggest clients, including Meredith Chen from Bristow, extended family scattered around 2 long tables, and a few trade partners we'd worked alongside for a decade, roofing material suppliers, our surety bond agent Phil, a couple of general contractors who'd given us our first big commercial breaks. There was a slideshow, cobbled together by one of the office admins, old photographs of my father standing next to that first truck in 1978, photographs of crews on jobs over the decades, and I remember sitting there feeling something close to pure, uncomplicated pride. The kind of pride you feel watching someone you love finally get a room full of people to acknowledge, out loud, everything you've always known about them. I remember specifically leaning over to Phil at one point during the slideshow, pointing out a photograph of myself at maybe 23 years old, standing on a job site in steel-toed boots, and joking that I looked like I hadn't slept in a week, and Phil laughing and saying that photo could have been taken any week for the past decade and nobody would know the difference. My father stood up after dinner with a glass of sparkling cider, because he'd never been much of a drinker even at celebrations, and gave a speech about the company, about starting with 1 truck and a ladder, about the crews who'd built it alongside him, about family being the reason any of it was worth the 40 years of early mornings and busted knuckles. I remember his voice catching slightly when he talked about my mother, about how she'd kept the books at that kitchen table until she couldn't anymore, and I remember reaching for a napkin because my own eyes were stinging. And then he said the words I have replayed in my head more times than I could ever count since. He said, "And it's time for me to hand the keys to the next generation. So I'm proud, so very proud, to announce that starting Monday morning, my son Kyle will be taking over as president and full owner of Callaway Roofing and Sheet Metal." He motioned Kyle up to the front of the room, and 40 people applauded, because that is simply what you do at a dinner like that. You clap when a proud father hands a microphone to his son in a good suit. And Kyle walked up there and gave a short, polished speech about legacy and the family name, and carrying the torch forward, a speech that I realized within about 10 seconds had clearly been written in advance and rehearsed, which meant he had known. He had known for some time, long enough to write and practice a speech about it. My father had told my brother before he ever told me, and neither one of them had told me at all, not privately beforehand, not with any warning, nothing. I found out standing in a rented banquet hall in front of 40 people, including my own biggest professional client, that 12 years of running a company from the inside out had earned me a polite round of applause and absolutely nothing else. I didn't make a scene. I want that on the record clearly, because everything that happened afterward, people have assumed I must have exploded, screamed, thrown a glass, made some kind of spectacle worthy of a movie. I didn't. I sat there and I clapped, because my hands started doing it before my brain had caught up to what my ears had just heard. And I smiled, because apparently your face knows how to arrange itself into that shape, even while the rest of you is quietly coming apart at every seam. I remember the specific sensation of the room getting slightly too loud and too bright all at once, the way sound does when your ears are ringing faintly and everyone around you seems to be reacting in a slightly different rhythm than you are. I stayed for another 20 minutes. I congratulated Kyle, hugging him stiffly, while Vanessa beamed beside him in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I hugged my father, who squeezed my shoulder and said quietly, close to my ear, "You'll always be the one who really runs things, Denise. Everybody in this room knows that." As if that sentence, murmured privately after the public humiliation, was supposed to be enough to balance the scale. It wasn't. It has never once been enough, not that night and not for a long time afterward. I found Meredith Chen by the coat check on my way out, and I told her, quietly, professionally, that I would be in touch about a matter the following week, and she looked at me with an expression that told me she'd already understood, in real time, watching that announcement happen, exactly what it meant for the woman she'd been working with for 8 years. I walked out to my truck in that gravel parking lot, climbed in, and sat there for 11 full minutes, both hands on the wheel, before I could make my hands steady enough to actually turn the key. I remember staring at the dashboard clock the entire time, watching the minutes change, feeling strangely detached from my own body, as though I were observing myself sitting there from somewhere just outside the windshield. I quit that night. Not dramatically, not with a phone call I'd regret in the morning. I wrote an email at 11:45, addressed formally to my father, CCing the company's general inbox so there would be no confusion later about the timestamp or the intent, stating that effective immediately I was resigning my position, that I would return the company truck and my keys within 48 hours, and that I wished the company well under its new leadership. I read it over exactly once, hit send before I could talk myself out of it, and then, at midnight, I called Meredith Chen's personal cell phone, a number she'd given me years earlier strictly for emergency scheduling issues during storm season, and I asked her, at midnight, on the same night I just watched my career get handed to someone else in a rented banquet hall, whether Bristow Commercial Group had any openings for someone with 12 years of commercial roofing operations experience who understood their entire property portfolio better than anyone alive who didn't already work for them. She laughed at first, assuming I was joking or venting. Then she realized I wasn't, and her voice changed entirely, and she told me to come in Monday morning at 9, and to bring nothing but myself. I want to pause here and tell you what happened to Callaway Roofing over the following 18 months, because I watched almost all of it unfold from the outside, piece by piece, through industry gossip, through mutual contacts. Through the professional vantage point I now had sitting across the table from Bristow whenever Callaway's name came up in a vendor review. And it is, I think, the clearest possible evidence of what 12 years of my labor had actually been holding together the entire time, invisibly, underneath a business that everyone assumed simply ran itself. Within the first 3 months, 2 of our best foremen, men who had worked for my father for over 15 years apiece, gave their notice within a week of each other. I heard, through the wife of one of them who I still kept in touch with, that Kyle had quietly discontinued the safety incentive program I'd built years earlier, a modest quarterly bonus tied to injury-free months that cost the company maybe a few $1,000s a quarter, but bought loyalty and vigilance that money alone couldn't purchase, and that he'd also cut the out-of-town per diem for crews working jobs more than 50 miles from the shop, calling it a cash flow adjustment in a memo that read like it had been written by someone who had never once actually slept in a motel after a 12-hour tear-off in 90-degree heat. I heard, too, that Kyle had let go of the office manager I'd trained personally over 4 years, replacing her with a cheaper hire who had no experience in the trade at all, apparently because Vanessa thought the office needed, in her words, a fresher energy. Within 6 months, Callaway missed the recertification deadline for its GAF Master Elite status, the same certification that had taken me nearly 2 years of dedicated effort to earn originally. Nobody, apparently, was tracking the compliance calendar anymore, the audit schedule, the continuing education requirements for the crew leads, the paperwork renewal windows that I used to flag on a shared calendar months in advance. Losing that certification meant losing eligibility for manufacturer-backed warranty jobs entirely, which meant losing an entire tier of commercial work overnight, the kind of work that had made up nearly 40% of the company's revenue under me. I remember hearing this particular piece of news from Phil over the phone, his voice careful, almost apologetic, as though he felt strange being the one to tell me, and I remember sitting with it for a long moment afterward, feeling less triumphant than I expected, and more like I was watching a slow-motion recording of a building I used to live in quietly losing its foundation. Within 9 months, I heard through Phil Restrepo, the same bond agent I'd worked with for years, who called me not to gossip, but because he genuinely seemed to want someone to talk to about it, that Callaway's experience modification rate had climbed sharply because of 2 serious injuries on jobs that had skipped their safety meetings entirely, a fall from an unprotected roof edge and a laceration from an improperly guarded saw, both of which spiked their workers' compensation premiums so badly that the math on residential jobs simply stopped working. A company operating on residential margins with commercial-sized insurance costs is a company bleeding money on every single job it completes, whether anyone in the office understands that math or not. Within a year, I heard through Phil, off the record, that Callaway had lost its surety bond renewal entirely. A bonding company reviews your financial statements, your work in progress reports, and your bank references every single year before deciding how much capacity to extend. And apparently the financials no longer supported bonding at anywhere near the same level, if they supported it at all, which meant Callaway could no longer legally bid the larger commercial contracts that require a payment and performance bond as a condition of the bid package, including, eventually, the very Bristow contract I had spent 8 years of my life building. I was in the room, professionally, sitting on the vendor side of the table rather than voting, when Bristow Commercial Group made the decision not to renew Callaway Roofing's approved vendor status. I recused myself from the actual vote because I understood clearly the ethics of my position, but I sat through the vendor performance review presentation Meredith Chen gave to the Capital Projects Committee. She walked through missed completion deadlines on 3 separate re-roof projects, 2 formal customer complaints about workmanship on a strip mall job that later had to be redone entirely by another contractor at Bristow's expense, a lapsed surety bond, a lapsed manufacturer certification, and a general pattern of communication failures that had left property managers calling emergency lines with no response for days during an active roof leak. The committee voted unanimously to remove Callaway from the approved vendor list. 18 months, almost to the week, after my father handed my brother the keys in front of 40 guests. The company that had taken me 12 years to build no longer had the bonding, the certifications, or the client relationships to survive as anything more than a struggling residential outfit running on fumes. And as I would only learn much later, on debt nobody outside the immediate family knew existed yet. I felt something during those 18 months that I'm not proud of, and something else that I am proud of. And I think both things can be true in the same chest at the same time. The something I'm not proud of is a kind of grim, quiet satisfaction watching a company I'd poured my 20s and most of my 30s into come apart in the hands of someone who had never once had to sit up at 2 in the morning, working out why any of it actually functioned. The something I am proud of is that I never once, not one single time, reached out to sabotage it, to gloat to a mutual contact, to make any of it harder than it already was on its own. I didn't have to lift a finger. I had simply stopped being the load-bearing wall holding the structure up, and gravity, patient and indifferent, did the rest of the work entirely on its own schedule. My father's health started declining around month 14 of Kyle's ownership. He had what the doctors called a transient ischemic event, a mild stroke, with some lasting effects on his speech, a slight slur that never fully went away, and some weakness in his left hand that made it hard for him to hold a coffee cup steady some mornings. I visited him in the hospital, and it was the first real, unguarded conversation we'd had since the night of that dinner. He apologized to me, sitting up in that hospital bed with an Roman 4 taped to the back of his good hand, his voice slightly slurred but clear enough in its intent, and he said something I did not understand the full weight of until many months later. He said, "I did something for you, Denise, that I should have done years ago out loud to your face, but I did it too quiet, and I did it too late, and I hope by the time you ever need it, it's enough." I thought, in that moment, that he meant the apology itself, that the whole sentence began and ended with those words. I did not learn until much later that he had meant something far more literal, far more concrete, and far more useful than any apology could ever have been. He never fully recovered his strength after that stroke. He lived another 8 months, mostly at home, with a home health aide named Patricia coming by during the days to help with medications and meals. I visited every single Sunday, not because Kyle asked me to, since Kyle barely visited at all during those months, always citing the company, always citing some crisis at the shop that needed his attention, but because my father was my father, and I loved him regardless of what had happened in that banquet hall. We never once talked about the company again during those Sunday visits. We talked about the weather, about old job stories from decades earlier, about a fishing trip he took me on once when I was 11 that I still remembered in strange, vivid detail, the smell of the lake in early morning, the way he'd shown me how to bait a hook without flinching. I brought him soup some Sundays, sat with him while he watched old westerns on a television with the volume turned up too loud, and neither of us ever mentioned the retirement dinner even once, as though some unspoken agreement had settled between us that certain wounds were better left quietly bandaged than reopened for examination. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, in his sleep, of what the death certificate listed simply as cardiac arrest. And I got the call from Patricia at 6:40 in the morning, standing in my kitchen still in my bathrobe with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that genuinely surprised me even in the middle of that grief, that some part of this had started at that banquet hall, that the slow accumulated stress of watching everything he'd built come apart in his son's hands had worn down a heart that had already given more than enough over 67 years. The vultures circled fast. I want to use that word deliberately, because there is no gentler or more accurate word for what happened in the first 48 hours after my father's death. Kyle and Vanessa arrived at his house that same afternoon, before the funeral home had even finished the intake paperwork, and by the very next morning they had already contacted a dumpster rental company to start, in Vanessa's own words to the sales rep on the phone that I overheard from the hallway, getting the house market ready. My father had been dead for barely 24 hours. Vanessa was already on the phone with a real estate agent discussing staging timelines before the second day was even over. I remember standing in the doorway of my father's bedroom that first evening, watching Vanessa run her hand along the dresser as though she were already mentally arranging where a staged bouquet of flowers might go, and feeling something cold settle low in my stomach that I did not yet have a name for. Vanessa Calloway, my brother's wife, is the kind of person who has built an entire identity around the appearance of having everything perfectly together. She ran a small home staging and lifestyle consulting business, the sort of enterprise built on carefully filtered Instagram photographs of impossibly arranged living rooms and captions about intentional living and curated calm. And she drove a leased Mercedes GLE that I would later learn. Once the financial records came out, the family could not remotely afford on paper, let alone in reality. She had strong opinions, loudly and confidently delivered, about what should happen to every single item in my father's house, and those opinions almost universally involved either selling it, staging it for the eventual open house, or hauling it straight to the dumpster, with very little room left in between for the possibility that any given object might matter to someone for reasons that had nothing to do with resale value. The day after the funeral, I drove out to my father's house to help, or so I told myself in the car on the way over, though some honest part of me knew I was also going because I could not stand the idea of Kyle and Vanessa going through his belongings entirely alone, deciding on their own what mattered and what didn't. When I arrived, there was already a dumpster sitting in the driveway, half full, and Vanessa was standing beside it in athleisure where that looked suspiciously like it had never touched a treadmill, directing two guys from a junk removal service on exactly what should go in next, pointing with her phone still in her other hand. I found my father's old metal toolbox sitting balanced on the lip of that dumpster, the same dented toolbox I had known my entire life, the one he always kept under his workbench in the garage, not for tools exactly, but for the odds and ends of a man's private history that don't have anywhere else to live, old union pay stubs from before he went out on his own, a pocket knife his own father had given him decades earlier, a small leather-bound ledger book from the earliest years of the company. I asked Vanessa what exactly that box was doing in the dumpster. She barely glanced up from her phone screen. "It's just some old junk box, Denise. There's like a rusty ledger and a bunch of receipts in there. Nothing worth keeping. We already went through it. There's no cash or jewelry or anything valuable in there." She said it the way you describe clearing out an overstuffed junk drawer before a garage sale, not the last physical container of a man's private inner life. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I'd take it off their hands since it was going in the trash anyway, mostly to avoid an argument I did not have the emotional bandwidth for on that particular day. She shrugged, already turning her attention back to the crew. Sure, whatever, one less thing to deal with, and went back to directing them toward my father's old recliner, the one he used to fall asleep in watching the evening news, which she wanted gone before any prospective buyers could see it, and think the house looked, in her word, dated. I watched two grown men carry that recliner out to the dumpster and toss it in without ceremony, and I had to walk to my truck for a minute just to breathe. I put the toolbox in the bed of my truck and drove home in a kind of numb silence, and I didn't open it until that night, alone at my own kitchen table. With a cup of coffee I never actually drank because it went cold while I sat there reading, hour bleeding into hour. Most of what was inside the box was exactly what Vanessa had described, old pay stubs going back decades, curling receipts, a pocket knife with my grandfather's initials scratched crudely into the handle, a rosary that had belonged to my grandmother that my father apparently kept even though I never once saw him attend a church service in my adult life. But at the very bottom of the box was the leather ledger, cracked and gone soft at the spine with age. The same book my father had used to track the company's earliest jobs back in 1978 and 1979. The handwriting on the front pages unmistakably his younger self, careful pencil figures, accounting for bundles of shingles, gallons of gas, hours logged by hand before anyone had ever heard the word software. I flipped through those early pages slowly at first, recognizing his handwriting the way you recognize a voice on the phone before the person even says their name. And it was strange comfort sitting there in my quiet kitchen, reading the earliest proof of everything he'd eventually built. On the very last page of that ledger, in handwriting that was noticeably shakier, clearly written sometime in the months following his stroke, was a note I have now read so many times I could recite it word for word in my sleep, and some nights I actually have. It said, "Denise, if you're reading this, something's happened to me and I'm not there to say it to your face, which is a coward's way out, but it's the only way I could manage it after everything. Do not sign anything for your brother or for Vanessa. Whatever they offer you, whatever they promise you, whatever they tell you it's for, do not trust them with anything. Not your name, not your signature, not your time. Save yourself first. Go see Aldous Reyes. He knows what I did and why. I should have told you the truth years ago instead of doing it this quiet, and I am sorrier about that than I have ever been sorry about anything in my whole life. You were always the one who understood what this all actually meant, all of it, from the very beginning. I'm sorry it took me until the very end to act like I knew it too. Love, Dad." I sat at that table for a long time after reading it, the coffee long gone cold, the kitchen light buzzing faintly overhead the way it always did when it needed a new bulb I kept forgetting to buy. I read it a second time, and a third, my hands trembling slightly by the third pass, not from fear exactly, but from the strange collision of grief and something sharper underneath it, something that felt almost like being handed a warning shot fired from beyond the grave. I did not, in that first reading, fully understand what I did was actually referring to. I assumed, honestly, in my grief-fogged state, that it referred to the retirement dinner, to the decision to hand Kyle the company, some kind of posthumous apology aimed squarely at that specific wound. It would be weeks before I understood that my father had meant something far more concrete, far more deliberate, and far more useful to me than a simple apology could ever have been. But even without grasping the full meaning that first night, I understood the instruction well enough to act on it immediately. Do not sign anything. Do not trust them. I put the ledger inside a fireproof lockbox I kept in my closet for important documents, tucked behind a stack of old tax returns, and I did not tell Kyle or Vanessa that it existed, not that night, not for a long time afterward. The manipulation started less than a week later, and it started, as these things so often do, wearing the mask of concern. I had, in the days following my father's death, been running on almost no sleep, skipping meals entirely some days, and one evening at my own apartment, I had what I can only describe honestly as a genuine physical collapse, chest tightness, sudden dizziness that dropped me to my knees in my own hallway, my blood pressure. When I finally checked it on the cheap cuff I kept in the bathroom, reading dangerously, alarmingly high. I drove myself to urgent care, hands shaking on the wheel the entire way, and they diagnosed acute stress combined with hypertension, gave me a prescription and strict instructions to rest, to reduce stress immediately, to avoid any major decisions for at least a few weeks, which under the actual circumstances of my life felt roughly equivalent to being told to stop breathing air. Kyle and Vanessa found out about that urgent care visit because I had listed Kyle as an emergency contact on old paperwork years earlier, and never bothered updating it, and the clinic called him when I was in no condition to drive myself home afterward. Within a single day, Vanessa was calling me constantly, her voice syrupy with a level of concern I had genuinely never once heard directed at me in a decade of holiday gatherings. "Denise, honey, you cannot be alone right now, not after everything you've been through, not with your blood pressure doing this to you. You need to come stay with us for a while. We have the whole guest suite set up. We'll take care of you properly. That's what family does for each other." Kyle echoed the same sentiment, a little more awkwardly, clearly coached beforehand, telling me over the phone that Dad would want them looking after me, that it was the least they could do given everything I'd apparently been through. I want to be honest that some small, exhausted, grieving part of me genuinely wanted to believe them, wanted there to be a version of this where my brother's wife calling me honey actually meant something warm and uncomplicated. I remember sitting on my couch that evening, phone in my lap after Vanessa's call ended, actually crying for a moment at the idea that maybe, in the wreckage of losing our father, some genuine family feeling could still exist between the three of us, something I had quietly grieved the loss of long before he ever died. But I had a ledger with my father's shaking handwriting locked in a box in my closet telling me, explicitly, not to trust either one of them. And I had 12 years of watching Kyle avoid every ounce of responsibility that ever came near him, and watching Vanessa manage the optics of a situation rather than its actual substance. And those two facts together were louder in my head than any syrupy phone call could ever be. I said yes to moving in any way. I made a decision, in that exact moment, sitting on my couch with the phone against my ear, that I still consider one of the smartest decisions of my entire life, though it did not feel smart at the time. It felt like swallowing broken glass on purpose. I decided to let them believe I was exactly as foggy, exhausted, and pliable as I appeared to be on the surface, while keeping my eyes wide open the entire time underneath it. I moved into their guest suite 8 days after my father's funeral, carrying a suitcase, my new medication, and a very carefully maintained performance of a woman too tired and too sad to ask a single hard question about anything. Within the first week of living under their roof, the requests started arriving, always carefully dressed up as help, never once presented as what they actually were. Vanessa suggested, gently, over dinner one evening, that it would make things so much easier for everyone if I just gave Kyle power of attorney, temporarily, purely so he could handle the estate paperwork without bothering me while I rested and recovered. Kyle mentioned, almost in passing while pouring himself a glass of wine, that Dad's will apparently named both of us as co-beneficiaries on some accounts, and that it would simplify things enormously if I just signed a quitclaim on my portion of the house so he could get it sold faster, since I clearly didn't need the money the way they did, what with the business apparently going through what he called a rough patch. I said, in a voice I deliberately made softer and slower than my normal speaking voice, that I was too overwhelmed to think clearly about paperwork right now, that my doctor had said stress was dangerous for my heart, that I just needed a little more time before I could look at anything legal or financial. I said some version of that sentence probably 30 separate times over the following 6 weeks, sitting at their kitchen island, curled up in the corner of their sectional, standing in the hallway in my robe while Vanessa hovered with a clipboard she'd apparently bought specifically for estate matters. I remember one particular evening where Vanessa actually laid 3 separate documents out on the kitchen counter in a neat fan, like she was dealing cards, and gently suggested we could knock them all out together right then. And I let my eyes go slightly glassy, told her I felt a headache coming on, and excused myself to lie down, leaving all 3 papers untouched. Every single time, I did not sign a single thing. But every single time, I said it in a way carefully calculated to make them believe I would, eventually, once I felt better, once they were patient enough with me. I let them believe patience was a winning strategy on their part. It bought me time, and time, as it turned out, was the one resource I actually had that they desperately needed and could not manufacture for themselves. The investigation, if you can even call what I did by that formal a word, started almost by accident, in the way these things often do, through a broken pipe rather than any grand decision on my part. About 3 weeks into staying with them, a pipe under the kitchen sink began leaking, a slow, steady drip that had already swollen the particle board cabinet floor beneath it, and I watched Kyle stand in front of that leak for a full 10 minutes, flashlight in hand, trying and failing to figure out which valve actually shut off the water to that fixture, eventually giving up entirely and calling an emergency plumber who charged a $350 after-hours fee to fix what turned out to be a $40 compression, fitting that any competent handyman could have replaced in 15 minutes. I watched him do this, standing in his own kitchen, in the house he supposedly ran a construction company out of on paper, completely unable to locate his own water shut-off valve, and something in me clicked into a colder, clearer gear than grief alone had allowed for up to that point in the whole ordeal. The next weekend, their garbage disposal jammed on a piece of chicken bone Vanessa had carelessly rinsed down the drain. And again, Kyle was ready to call a service technician for a job that took me all of 4 minutes with an Allen wrench I found rattling around in a junk drawer, using the same simple trick you use to free a jammed disposal by manually rotating the flywheel from underneath through the hex socket. Vanessa actually said, watching me kneel under her sink with the flashlight from her phone propped against a cup, "I didn't know you knew how to do stuff like that." And I said, keeping my voice mild, that 12 years of running a construction company teaches you a few practical things along the way. She laughed a little too brightly at that and quickly changed the subject to something about her upcoming client photo shoot. But I noticed her eyes flick toward Kyle for just a second in that moment, something uneasy passing silently between them that had nothing to do with plumbing. And I filed that look away carefully, the way you file away a strange sound in an engine that you know you'll need to remember later. A third small incident happened not long after, when a breaker tripped during a storm and the entire downstairs went dark. And I found myself the only one in the house who knew immediately to check the electrical panel in the garage before calling anyone, flipping the tripped breaker back with a confidence that visibly unsettled Kyle, who stood in the doorway watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time, but would later recognize as something closer to suspicion than gratitude, as though some part of him had already begun to sense that the sister he'd assumed was fading quietly into helplessness, might still have far more competence tucked underneath the surface than either of them had accounted for. Over the following weeks, I noticed a whole accumulation of things I would never have caught if I hadn't spent 12 years learning to read the rhythms of a business quietly buckling under stress. I noticed that Kyle took phone calls out on the back patio with the sliding glass door pulled fully shut behind him, pacing in tight little circles across the same 6 feet of concrete, his voice pitched low and tight in a register I recognized instantly from years of watching him take calls from bookies and rehab intake coordinators back when we were both still living under our parents' roof. I noticed that Vanessa dodged 3 separate calls from the same unlisted number over the course of a single week, letting each one ring through to voicemail without ever answering, her jaw visibly tightening every single time the screen lit up on the counter between us. I noticed a FedEx envelope from a company called Vantage Bridge Capital arrive twice within 10 days, and I noticed Kyle intercept the mail personally both times, walking straight from the mailbox to his office before either Vanessa or I ever got a clear look at the return address. I also noticed the spending, and the spending simply did not match a couple whose primary business was, by every outward account I could see, failing badly. A new boat arrived on a trailer in their driveway one Saturday morning, a 22-foot bowrider with a wraparound windshield. Financed, based on paperwork I glimpsed sitting carelessly on the kitchen counter before Kyle swept it into a folder and tucked it under his arm, at an interest rate that made my stomach turn just doing the mental math. Vanessa took a trip to Nashville that same month for what she called a business retreat with 2 other home staging consultants she followed on social media, and she came back with an entirely new set of furniture for the guest suite I was staying in, ostensibly purchased for my comfort, though I noted the receipts, left carelessly on the counter beside a bowl of decorative lemons, totaled just under $4,000 for a single weekend of shopping. None of this fit a household staring down real financial distress. It fit a household spending like the distress had not caught up with them yet, or like somebody in that house had already convinced themselves a solution was coming before any bill actually came due. I started paying much closer attention to Kyle's home office, a converted spare bedroom just off the garage that he kept locked at all times, even during the 15 seconds it took him to walk to the mailbox and back. I noticed the lock itself was a standard residential deadbolt, the kind with a 5-pin tumbler, nothing sophisticated, nothing that would have stopped anyone with even a passing familiarity with lockpicking. And I had picked exactly one lock before in my entire life, on a company gang box back on a job site in my 2nd year running cruise, when we'd lost the only key and had a locksmith friend of my father's named Ronnie Talbot come out to open it. And Ronnie, bored on a slow rain delay afternoon, had taught me the basics with a tension wrench and a rake pick. More as a party trick to pass the time than any real skill he expected me to ever actually use again in my life. I still had that small zippered pouch of picks buried in my truck's glove box, half forgotten under old registration papers, and a decade's worth of gas receipts, a relic of one slow Tuesday nearly 10 years earlier. I want to be clear that I did not take the step of actually using them lightly. I thought about it seriously for several days before I acted, turning the decision over and over in my mind at night in that unfamiliar guest bed, weighing whether what I was contemplating crossed a line I couldn't ever walk back from afterward. I lay awake more than one night running through the possible consequences, telling myself that if I was wrong about all of it, if this was simply grief making me paranoid, then breaking into my own brother's home office was a betrayal I'd have to carry for the rest of my life. But I kept returning, again and again, to my father's note sitting in that lockbox at home. Do not trust them, save yourself, and to the plain, undeniable fact that I was already living under their roof performing a version of helplessness I had chosen entirely on purpose, precisely so I could figure out exactly what was happening before they managed to extract what they actually wanted from me. One evening, when Kyle and Vanessa left for a dinner they'd been invited to by one of Vanessa's staging clients, a couple celebrating some anniversary, I told them I was far too tired to join and would rather rest quietly at the house. And as soon as their car cleared the driveway and turned the corner, I walked straight to that locked office door with a small pouch of tools I had not touched in almost a decade. It took me nearly 20 minutes, far longer than it should have, my hands noticeably rustier than I remembered them being on that gang box years ago, sweat gathering at my hairline despite the air conditioning. But the tumblers finally gave way, and I stepped into a room that told me more in the following 15 minutes than 6 weeks of syrupy phone calls and clipboard requests ever had. There was a shredder in the corner, its clear bin nearly full to capacity, strips of paper cut in a crosscut pattern, but not so finely shredded that certain fragments of print weren't still legible if you were patient enough, and had enough time on your hands late at night to piece them back together like some grim, private jigsaw puzzle. There was a metal filing cabinet, unlocked this particular time since Kyle apparently reserved his caution for the door itself, containing folders labeled with a level of disorganization that told me, more clearly than almost anything else in that entire room, that whoever was now handling Callaway Roofing's finances possessed none of the discipline it had taken to run those same finances properly for 12 straight years under me. What I found, over the 2 weeks that followed, small handfuls of shredded paper carried back to my guest suite in a grocery bag under my folded pajamas, taped painstakingly to sheets of printer paper under a desk lamp late at night, while the rest of the house slept, amounted to a portrait of a company and a household in total. Quiet, escalating financial collapse, propped up by increasingly desperate and increasingly illegal measures. The company's actual bank statements, which I understood immediately and completely because I had spent 12 years reading statements exactly like them, showed an accounts payable aging report with the overwhelming majority of vendor invoices sitting past 90 days overdue. A clear, unmistakable sign of a business that has stopped paying its bills promptly, not out of oversight, but out of genuine inability. There were 3 separate merchant cash advance agreements stacked one on top of another, what people in small business lending circles sometimes call debt stacking, each new advance taken out specifically to cover the daily payment shortfall left behind by the previous one, at effective annual interest rates north of 80% once you worked out the actual math on the daily withdrawal structure, a pattern that any experienced lender or accountant would recognize instantly as a business locked firmly into its own death spiral. I remember sitting cross-legged on the guest bed at nearly 2 a.m, with those taped fragments spread across the comforter, running the numbers in my head almost automatically, the way I used to run them on real job-costing sheets, and feeling a strange, cold recognition settle over me. This wasn't mismanagement anymore. This was a company that had already died on paper and was simply being kept moving like a puppet, propped up by loan after loan, each one more predatory than the last. But the documents that stopped my breath entirely, that made me set the folder down on the desk and sit very still in the dark for several long minutes, were inside a folder marked, almost mockingly given what it actually contained: family trust. Inside was a copy of a collateral pledge agreement, dated 4 full months after my father's death, pledging an interest in what was described in careful legal language as the Callaway Family Land Trust, the entity that I would soon learn held the 4 acres and the shop building that Callaway Roofing physically operated from, as security against a bridge loan of $480,000 extended through Vantage Bridge Capital. At the bottom of that pledge agreement was a signature, formally notarized with an embossed seal bearing my own name, Denise Callaway. A signature I had absolutely never made, on a document I had never once laid eyes on before that night, notarized by a notary public whose stamp I did not recognize from any office I had ever worked with. Dated for a specific day, I clearly remembered because I had spent the entirety of it at a Bristow Commercial Group quarterly review, meeting 45 minutes away, with a physical sign-in log, and a conference room full of colleagues who could place me somewhere else entirely at the exact time. This document claimed I had appeared in person before a notary to sign it. I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time, the office silent around me, except for the faint hum of the shredder's motor cooling down. 12 years of reading contracts, lien waivers, and loan documents had taught me exactly what I was looking at, and there was no ambiguity left in it at all. This wasn't a clerical mistake. This was forgery, deliberate and structural rather than incidental, because whoever had assembled this loan package needed my signature specifically. Needed it because I now understood for the first time sitting in that dark office. The family trust required some kind of consent from me as a named party, likely a trustee or a beneficiary, holding rights that Kyle alone could not legally override no matter how badly he wanted to. Someone had decided, at some point, that rather than simply ask me and risk hearing the word no, it would be far more efficient to manufacture a yes on my behalf. The final piece of the puzzle came together from those painstakingly reassembled shredded fragments, over 3 more nights of careful taping under that desk lamp. And it included partial bank wire confirmations, referencing an account at a bank I did not recognize at all, with routing information that, when I searched it later from a public library computer, specifically to avoid leaving any trace on their home network, traced back to a correspondent banking relationship commonly used by financial institutions in Belize. A separate fragment, a printed email chain reassembled almost like a scrap of lace, showed Vanessa corresponding with someone identified only by an initial about opening an account for an entity called Ashworth Holdings International, Ashworth being Vanessa's own maiden name, an entity that did not appear anywhere in any Secretary of State business registry I could find for our home state, which told me plainly that it likely existed offshore, exactly where those wire fragments had already pointed me. Putting the entire shape of it together took me the better part of 2 full weeks, but by the end, I understood the scheme with a kind of total, cold clarity, the same way you finally understand a roof failure once you've traced a water stain all the way back to its true origin point, instead of the spot on the ceiling where it just happened to first show up. Kyle and Vanessa had run the company into insolvency within 18 months of taking it over. Facing collapse, they had taken on increasingly predatory financing to stay afloat, stacking merchant cash advances on top of each other until the daily payment obligations alone exceeded anything the company could realistically bring in on its shrinking revenue. To secure one final, much larger bridge loan against the only genuinely valuable asset left, the land and building held inside my father's family trust, they needed a signature they did not legally have the right to obtain on their own, and so they forged mine. And somewhere in that entire process, rather than using the loan proceeds to actually try to save the business, at least some meaningful portion of the funds had instead been quietly diverted into an offshore account registered under Vanessa's maiden name, which told me plainly that the plan was never truly rescue. The plan was extraction. Take whatever could be taken, let the loan eventually default, let the trust property get seized by Vantage Bridge Capital as collateral, and let whoever's forged signature happen to be sitting on that pledge agreement, mine, absorb the legal fallout when creditors and investigators eventually came looking for someone to hold accountable. I understood, finally, sitting alone in that dark office at nearly midnight, that I was not being kept in that guest suite to convalesce out of anything resembling family love. I was being kept close, watched, gradually softened, so that eventually when they needed one more real signature, a modification, a renewal, something the forged one simply couldn't legally cover on its own. I would be pliable enough by then to give it to them without asking a single hard question. I had been playing weak entirely on purpose for weeks. I had no idea, until that exact moment, how correct that instinct had actually been, or how much real danger I had been quietly standing inside of the entire time without fully grasping it. It was around this point that I finally understood the rest of my father's note, and finally, with hands that were not entirely steady, called Aldous Reyes. Aldous Reyes had been my father's attorney for almost 30 years, a careful, unhurried, quiet man who had handled the company's contracts, and as it turned out, far more of my father's private planning than I had ever once known about during his lifetime. I called his office from the parking lot of a grocery store, deliberately not from Kyle and Vanessa's house, and told his assistant it was urgent, regarding Walter Calloway's estate. He called me back within the hour himself, and when I told him I had my father's old ledger in my possession, with a note written on its last page, there was a pause on the line long enough that I could hear him breathing on the other end, that I knew before he said another single word that this was not news to him at all. We met 2 days later at his office, a modest, unglamorous suite located above a hardware store downtown, the kind of place with worn carpet and a coffee maker that had clearly seen decades of use, framed photographs of local Little League teams he'd apparently sponsored over the years lining the hallway wall. I brought the ledger itself, the reconstructed shredded fragments carefully arranged in a manila folder, and photographs I had carefully taken of the forged pledge agreement on my phone before returning the actual original document to the filing cabinet exactly where I had found it, down to the angle of the folder tab. Aldous Reyes read through every single piece of it without saying a word for almost 20 full minutes, his reading glasses low on his nose, occasionally sliding a page closer to the desk lamp to examine it more carefully. And then he finally set it all down on his desk in a neat stack, and looked up at me in a way that told me he was about to hand me something my father had specifically asked him to hold onto for exactly this kind of circumstance. He told me that 4 years before his death, not long after Kyle's second stint in rehab, my father had come to him with a specific and unusual request. He wanted to formally separate the operating company, Callaway Roofing and Sheet Metal LLC, from the land and building it physically operated on, which my father owned outright, 4 acres and a 14,000 square foot shop and office building worth, at the time of the transfer, close to $2.5 million on the open market. My father restructured that land into an irrevocable trust called the Callaway Family Land Trust, and named me, not Kyle, as successor trustee, with sole and exclusive authority over any sale, lease modification, or encumbrance of the trust's real property, effective the moment his own role as trustee ended. Kyle would inherit the operating company itself, the trucks, the equipment, the contracts, the goodwill, such as it was. But the ground it physically stood on would never belong to him outright, and could never be pledged, sold, or mortgaged without my express consent as trustee. Aldous told me my father had said, almost word for word, sitting in that very same office 4 years earlier, "I love my son, but I've watched him spend other people's patience like it's an inheritance he was born entitled to, and I am not going to leave the one thing in this family that can't ever be replaced, sitting somewhere he can gamble it away in a bad year. If he ever tries to take it anyway, without her, I want it to end up entirely in her hands, not his, no exceptions." My father had instructed Aldous to write a specific provision into the trust document, sometimes called a forfeiture clause or an in terrorem clause, ordinarily used in estate planning to discourage beneficiaries from formally contesting a will in court, but repurposed here for something far more pointed and specific. The clause stated plainly that if any beneficiary or their agent ever attempted to encumber, pledge, or transfer trust property through fraud, forged authorization, or an unauthorized signature of any kind, that beneficiary's entire interest in the trust would be permanently and irrevocably forfeited, reduced to a token $1, and full beneficial ownership of the property would vest entirely and automatically in the successor trustee, meaning me, without further court action, required beyond confirmation of the underlying fraud. In other words, my father had quietly built a trap 4 full years before he ever died, not out of any certainty that Kyle would fall this far, but out of a clear-eyed, unsentimental understanding of exactly what Kyle was capable of if left unsupervised long enough. And he had built that trap to spring, shut entirely in my favor the very moment anyone ever tried to use fraud to get around me. The forged pledge agreement I had discovered in that filing cabinet was not merely evidence of a crime committed against a bank. Under the specific terms of my father's trust, it was the exact triggering event that would hand me everything, provided it could be properly proven, provided the fraud was documented correctly, provided it moved through the right legal and law enforcement channels, instead of simply sitting quietly in my possession as a private grievance. Aldous told me the next steps had to be handled with extreme care and precision, because a forged, notarized document tied to a nearly $500,000 commercial loan was not simply a family matter destined for a quiet probate court hearing. It was a matter for the originating bank's fraud department, and very likely for federal authorities as well, given the interstate nature of the loan itself and the apparent offshore wire activity connected to it. He made a call that same afternoon, right there in front of me, to a contact he had cultivated over years at Meridian Trust Bank, the institution that had originated the bridge loan through Vantage Bridge Capital's warehouse funding line, a compliance officer named Grace Whitfield, who specifically handled fraud escalations for the bank's commercial lending division. Within 3 days, Grace Whitfield's team had compared the notarized signature on that pledge agreement against known, verified exemplars of my actual signature, pulled from years of legitimate business documents I had signed while running the company, loan applications, lien waivers, tax filings, and confirmed conclusively what I had already known in my gut the moment I first saw it, that the signatures did not match under any reasonable forensic analysis, and further, that the notary's official journal for that specific date contained no matching entry at all, meaning the notarization itself had almost certainly been falsified alongside the signature. Because the loan had moved across state lines, and because the reconstructed wire fragments pointed clearly toward an offshore account, Meridian Trust Bank's fraud department escalated the entire case beyond their own internal compliance process. And within a single week, I was sitting across a small conference table from an FBI agent named Priya Nandan, from the Bureau's white-collar crimes unit, with Aldous Reyes seated quietly beside me for support. Agent Nandan was direct, in a way I found strangely calming after weeks spent performing fog and softness for people who were actively trying to use me. She told me the scale of what her office already suspected was significantly larger than a single forged pledge agreement in isolation, that they believed Kyle and Vanessa's use of an offshore entity to receive diverted loan proceeds could constitute wire fraud, bank fraud, and potentially money laundering under federal statute, charges that carried genuine, substantial prison time. And she asked me directly whether I would be willing to continue exactly what I was already doing, appearing compliant, foggy, medically unwell, while helping her office gather the final concrete pieces of documented proof needed to move forward with an arrest and a coordinated asset freeze. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation. She gave me specific, careful instructions that afternoon, and again in a follow-up call 2 days later. I was not, under any circumstances, to confront anyone directly about what I knew. I was not to remove any further original documents from the house, since chain of custody mattered enormously for eventual prosecution, and she did not want anything I had taken called into question later by a defense attorney looking for procedural weaknesses to exploit. Instead, I was to photograph documents carefully where I found them, noting exact dates and locations in a small notebook she gave me. And critically, I was to keep my phone in my jacket pocket recording audio during any conversation where Kyle or Vanessa discussed the loan, the trust, or asked me to sign anything at all, since our state allowed one-party consent recording, and I, as an active participant in those conversations, was fully and legally entitled to record them for my own protection. She also asked me to try to identify, through casual, unassuming conversation, when exactly Kyle and Vanessa intended to force a final signature out of me, since her office believed, based on the loan documents already recovered, that a forbearance deadline with Vantage Bridge Capital was rapidly approaching, one likely to trigger a final, desperate push for whatever additional authorization they believed they still needed from me. I went back to that house that same night and resumed the exact performance I had been quietly running for weeks. Tired eyes, slow speech, gentle compliant nods. A woman still too fogged by grief and blood pressure medication to think clearly about anything as complicated as legal paperwork. I had never in my entire life felt so completely awake on the inside while looking so entirely asleep on the outside. I remember sitting at their dinner table that first night back, listening to Vanessa chatter about a client's kitchen renovation, nodding along in slow, distant agreement while the tiny recorder app on my phone quietly logged every word, and feeling a strange, cold thrill I had never once associated with grief before, the particular thrill of finally having the upper hand in a house where I had spent weeks pretending not to. The forbearance deadline, I learned through a phone call I overheard while pretending to nap on their living room couch under a blanket, was 11 days away. Vantage Bridge Capital was demanding either full payment of the current outstanding advance balance or additional collateral to extend the loan another quarter. And Kyle's voice on that call carried a pitch I had not heard from him since he was 26 years old, calling my father collect from a county jail cell after his DUI arrest. Vanessa, in the kitchen shortly afterward, was the one who finally said the quiet part out loud, low enough that she clearly believed I was still asleep on the couch 15 feet away, with a dish towel over my eyes. She's going to have to sign something real this time. Kyle, the fake one only gets us so far if anyone ever actually looks closely at it. We need her name on something she actually put there herself, in her own hand, something that'll actually hold up in front of a judge. Kyle's answer chilled me more thoroughly than almost anything else in the entire ordeal up to that point. He said, flatly, "She'll do it, Vanessa, just look at her lately. She can barely remember what day of the week it is anymore. We just need to pick the right moment, and she'll sign whatever we put in front of her." I reported that entire exchange to Agent Nandon the next morning from the same grocery store parking lot I always used, and she told me it confirmed precisely what her office needed: clear, unambiguous evidence of intent to obtain a second, coerced signature specifically to paper over the first fraudulent one, which meant they were now actively planning to manipulate someone they themselves believed to be medically and mentally compromised into signing a binding legal document. Itself, a serious aggravating factor under federal sentencing guidelines. She told me the Bureau would be fully ready to move the moment they actually attempted it, but that she wanted one more thing first: a final, unambiguous confirmation of just how far Kyle and Vanessa were truly willing to go. Because juries and judges, she said plainly, respond powerfully to clear demonstrations of a defendant's genuine character. And she wanted a moment on record that showed, without any room left for ambiguity, exactly what kind of people the court would eventually be dealing with. I decided, on my own initiative, without her explicit instruction, to give her exactly that moment, in a way I had not originally planned for, but that felt, once the idea formed fully in my mind one sleepless night, like the only fitting test left available to me. I had genuinely fainted once already during this entire ordeal, from real, unmanufactured stress and real high blood pressure, so a second episode would surprise absolutely no one in that house and raise no particular alarm about what I might actually be doing behind the scenes. I chose a Thursday evening, 3 days before the forbearance deadline, when I knew both Kyle and Vanessa would be home together, tension already running visibly high, because a document courier was expected the following morning, carrying paperwork from Vantage Bridge Capital's attorney. I waited until Vanessa was occupied in the kitchen, and Kyle was seated in the living room hunched over his laptop, and I let myself sink slowly, deliberately, to the hallway floor directly between the two rooms, my body going carefully limp, my breathing shallow and just audible enough, a performance built entirely on 12 years of watching how real medical emergencies actually look and sound on a job site when a worker went down from heat exhaustion or a fall from a ladder. I heard Vanessa's footsteps first, quick and sharp against the hardwood, and for one brief, foolish half-second I actually thought, with something close to relief flooding through my chest, that maybe I had been wrong about her after all, that maybe some sliver of genuine decency was finally about to surface when it counted most. Instead, I heard her footsteps stop abruptly at the hallway entrance, and I heard her voice, not panicked in the slightest, but simply irritated, calling back sharply toward the living room. Kyle, your sister's on the floor again. I swear this woman picks the absolute worst possible timing for this. And then, instead of kneeling down beside me, instead of checking my pulse or reaching for her phone to call for help, I heard her footsteps continue right past me, straight into the office, toward the courier documents that had arrived the day before and were still sitting out on the desk. Documents I later learned she was specifically afraid I might see if I happened to wake up alone in that room. Kyle came around the corner a moment later, and through the narrow, nearly closed slit of my eyes, I watched him look down at me lying motionless on the hallway floor. Actually pause for a real, measurable second. Some visible internal calculation flickering across his face, and then step directly over my outstretched legs to follow his wife into the office instead, his voice low and urgent, asking her whether she'd found the folder yet, whether the numbers in it matched what the attorney had told them on the phone that morning. I lay on that hallway floor for close to 90 full seconds, which I promise you is an extraordinarily long stretch of time to hold perfectly still on a hard floor, while two people who share your own blood step directly over your body to go protect a folder of fraudulent paperwork, instead of even briefly checking whether you were alive or dead. Nobody called 911. Nobody knelt down beside me. Nobody said my name out loud with anything even remotely resembling fear for my well-being. I remember lying there listening to the low murmur of their voices from the office, the rustle of papers, a printer whirring to life somewhere, and thinking, with a strange, detached clarity that surprised even me in the moment, that I finally had my answer, the one I had half hoped, against all reason, I would never actually need. When I finally stirred deliberately and let out a soft, disoriented sound, Vanessa reappeared in the hallway doorway with the folder still tucked firmly under her arm and said, in a tone far more annoyed than concerned, "Oh good, you're up. You scared me for a second there." Which was, I understood in that exact moment with total and complete finality, a lie about being scared for entirely the wrong reason, since nothing about her actual behavior in the previous 90 seconds had suggested even a flicker of genuine fear for my safety at all. Whatever residual loyalty I had still been quietly carrying for my brother, whatever small, foolish hope I had been protecting somewhere deep down that some earlier, better version of the boy I grew up alongside might still exist underneath everything he had become, ended permanently on that hallway floor. I understood, completely and finally, with no room left for negotiation with myself, that if I had actually been dying in that exact moment, genuinely dying on their hardwood floor, neither one of them would have stopped moving toward that folder to find out for certain. The confrontation came on the day of the forbearance deadline itself, 3 days later, and it arrived exactly the way Agent Nandon and I had anticipated together during our planning calls. Kyle came into the guest suite that morning and told me, with a gentleness that made my skin crawl given everything I now knew with total certainty, that we needed to run out to the bank that afternoon. Just a quick errand, some routine paperwork to help finalize a few things with the business now that Dad was gone. Nothing at all to worry about. He'd drive the whole way. I wouldn't even have to think about it. Vanessa added, breezing past with her coffee, that it would be good for me to finally get some fresh air. And I said, in my softest, most compliant voice, that I supposed I could manage a short drive if it would genuinely help him with things. We drove to a branch of Meridian Trust Bank I had never once visited before, a location Kyle had specifically chosen, as I would later learn from Agent Nandon, precisely because it sat outside the usual branch network, where Vantage Bridge Capital's regular loan officer worked, hoping the unfamiliarity of new faces would keep any questions to an absolute minimum. I remember the drive itself, Kyle chattering nervously about nothing in particular. The weather, a game he'd watched the night before, filling the silence the way people do when they are trying very hard not to think about what they are actually about to do. We were led into a small private office by a bank representative I didn't recognize, and Kyle placed a manila folder on the desk between us, sliding a single page across toward me along with a pen, telling me, in a voice carefully pitched for maximum reassurance, that it was just a signature on a routine account update. Nothing complicated at all, just Dad's name transitioning off some old paperwork. Would I mind just initialing here and signing there? I had my phone recording steadily in my jacket pocket, exactly as Agent Nandon had instructed, and I looked down at that document just long enough to confirm that it was, in fact, a collateral modification agreement extending and increasing the pledge against the family trust property. Exactly what she had predicted with total accuracy that they would eventually attempt. I set the pen down deliberately on the desk instead of picking it up, and I looked directly at my brother, and I said the single sentence I had prepared carefully in advance for this exact moment, the one true thing I needed him to hear before anything else happened in that room. I told him, "Dad already told me not to trust either of you with anything that has my name on it, and for the first time in my whole life, I actually listened to him before it cost me absolutely everything." Kyle's face moved through several distinct expressions in the span of about 2 seconds. Confusion first, then something that looked genuinely close to fear, and Vanessa, who had been sitting quietly beside him this entire time, suddenly reached across the desk for the folder, her carefully maintained composure cracking visibly for the very first time I had ever witnessed in a decade of knowing her, her voice rising sharply in a way that drew the immediate attention of the bank employee standing near the office door. That employee, I learned only afterward from Agent Nandon, had already been fully briefed that morning by Grace Whitfield's compliance team, who had coordinated closely with Nandon's office. Once they confirmed through internal branch systems that Kyle had scheduled this exact appointment using the forged pledge agreement's specific account reference number. The office door opened before Vanessa could even finish her sentence, and 2 federal agents stepped calmly into the room, along with a bank compliance officer and Agent Priya Nandon herself, who had been sitting quietly in an unmarked vehicle in the parking lot for the previous 40 minutes, waiting for exactly this signal. What followed happened quickly, in the clipped, procedural language of people executing something they had planned meticulously for days in advance. Agent Nandon identified herself and her colleague, informed Kyle and Vanessa plainly that they were being detained in connection with an ongoing investigation into bank fraud, wire fraud, and forgery related to the Calloway family land trust, and asked them both to step calmly away from the desk. Vanessa's voice cracked into something close to genuine hysteria, insisting repeatedly that there had been some kind of terrible misunderstanding, that everything was perfectly fine, that this was simply a private family matter that didn't concern anyone else in that room. Kyle said almost nothing at all, which was, of every single moment in that entire year, the one that told me the most about who he actually was underneath everything, that faced with the total, sudden collapse of everything he had built on other people's borrowed trust, he had absolutely nothing left to say in his own defense. I was asked, gently, by Agent Nandon, whether I was all right, and I told her honestly that I was, and I handed her my phone with the recorded audio from the entire drive over and the conversation inside that office. Audio that captured Kyle's own voice instructing me plainly to sign, and captured, in the chaotic moments immediately after the agents entered the room, Vanessa's panicked, blurted admission that the money, some of it at least, had already been moved somewhere they, quote, couldn't get it back from quickly, an admission that would later become a key piece of documented evidence regarding the offshore transfers during the subsequent prosecution. They were both arrested that same afternoon, right there in the bank's small back office, in front of the compliance officer and the 2 federal agents. I remember standing in the small parking lot afterward, watching them each led separately to unmarked cars, Vanessa still shouting something about lawyers and misunderstandings, Kyle silent, his eyes finding mine for just a moment before an agent guided him into the back seat, and I remember feeling nothing that resembled triumph in that moment at all, only a heavy, hollow exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes after holding your breath for far longer than any body was ever built to hold it. Because I had never once signed the modification agreement placed in front of me, and because the original pledge agreement had already been conclusively proven forged through forensic signature comparison, the trigger clause in my father's trust activated exactly as Aldous Reyes had explained it would months earlier, converting Kyle's entire beneficial interest in the Calloway family land trust to a token $1, investing full ownership of the land and the shop building entirely in me, as successor trustee, effective immediately upon legal confirmation of the underlying fraud, which came formally within just a few weeks once Grace Whitfield's fraud department and the FBI finished their complete documentation package for the U.S. Attorney's Office. The aftermath unfolded over the following year in the slow, procedural, unglamorous way these things actually do in real life. Nothing at all like the tidy speed of a television courtroom drama. Kyle pleaded guilty to charges of forgery, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud, in a plea arrangement negotiated by his defense attorney that spared him a lengthy trial but did not spare him prison time, and he was sentenced to 4 years in a federal facility, along with a formal restitution order requiring payments to both Vantage Bridge Capital and Meridian Trust Bank for the portions of the diverted loan proceeds that investigators were ultimately able to trace and recover. Vanessa was convicted separately, in a shorter trial that lasted just under 2 weeks, on charges specifically related to the offshore account and money laundering. Since the Ashworth Holdings international entity registered in Belize was traced directly and unambiguously to funds diverted from that bridge loan, and she received her own sentence of just under 3 years, along with a separate restitution order tied specifically to her role. Their house was sold at a considerable loss to satisfy various creditors within months of the arrest. The boat was repossessed within 4 weeks, still gleaming on its trailer in an impound lot the last time anyone I knew ever saw it. The leased Mercedes went back to the dealership before the first month's payment even came due again. What remained of the operating company, Callaway Roofing and Sheet Metal LLC, already thoroughly gutted of its bonding capacity, its manufacturer certifications, and its entire client base by that point, was formally dissolved in bankruptcy court less than a year after my brother's arrest. Its trucks and equipment auctioned off piece by piece, one crane and one aging box truck at a time, to satisfy the merchant cash advance lenders standing at the front of a very long creditor's line. I did not attend the equipment auction itself, though a former crew member of ours called to tell me about it afterward, describing the strange, quiet sadness of watching machines my father had bought with actual cash decades earlier get sold off for pennies on the dollar to strangers who had no idea what any of it had once meant. I did not attend either sentencing hearing out of anything resembling personal satisfaction, though I won't pretend to you that there wasn't some measure of grim, quiet closure in watching a system finally hold 2 people fully accountable for treating every single relationship in their lives, including one built on my own father's blood and 40 years of his labor, as nothing more than a resource to be extracted and discarded once used up. What I felt, sitting quietly in the back of that courtroom on the one day I did attend, more than anything else, was a kind of exhausted, bone-deep grief for the brother I had grown up alongside, who had made choice after choice after choice that led him inevitably to that exact folding chair in that exact hallway, and for my father, who had seen all of this coming with enough clarity, years in advance of his own death, to quietly build a trapdoor that most parents never find either the foresight or the heart to construct for their own children. I remember Kyle glancing back once briefly before he was led away, and I remember not looking away from him, not out of anger anymore by that point, but because I owed him, and myself, the honesty of not flinching from what we had both become to each other. What I ultimately received, in the end, was not some windfall I feel any lingering need to apologize for or explain away, because it had never truly been anyone else's money or land to begin with. It had simply been held for me, quietly and deliberately, by a trust my father built specifically because he understood, far better than any of us wanted to admit while he was still alive to say it out loud, exactly what his son was capable of if left entirely to his own devices. I took full ownership of the 4 acres and the shop building, and with the patient help of Aldous Rays, and honestly, with the professional relationships I had spent 12 full years building, and then 18 months watching slowly wither away in someone else's careless hands, I restarted a small commercial roofing operation under a new name, Callaway and Daughters, though I have no daughters of my own yet, a name I chose deliberately because it felt like the truest possible correction I could make to a story that had, for one deeply humiliating night in a rented banquet hall, gotten the family's own history exactly backward. Meredith Chen was among the very first calls I made once the paperwork cleared, and Bristow Commercial Group signed on as our first commercial client within the first quarter of operation, on the strength of 12 years of trust that, it turned out, my brother's collapse could never fully erase, because that trust had never actually belonged to the company's printed name in the first place. It had always belonged to me, quietly, the entire time, whether anyone had bothered to write it down or not. I remember standing in that same old shop building, now legally mine, walking the same concrete floor I had walked 1,000 times before as an employee with no title, and feeling something settle in my chest that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something very close to peace. I think about my father's quiet, careful planning often, the way he built a fail-safe years before he ever needed it, and never once said a single word about it out loud, choosing instead to let a note scrawled in an old ledger and a lawyer he trusted implicitly do the talking for him after he was already gone. I understand now, in a way I couldn't possibly have understood standing in that banquet hall, that his silence that night was never really about believing Kyle deserved the company more than I did. It was about a man who had spent his entire life being genuinely bad at saying difficult things directly to the people he loved most, trying instead, in the only language he fully trusted, paperwork, structure, quiet legal contingency, to make absolutely sure that if his son ever failed the family in the exact way he privately feared he might, his daughter would not be left standing in the wreckage with nothing at all to show for 12 years of her own life. He was wrong about how to say it to my face when it mattered most. He was not wrong, not for one single second, about how to actually protect me from what was coming. If there is one lesson worth carrying out of any of this, it's that the people who love you best don't always manage to say it out loud in the exact moment you most need to hear it. But the ones who are truly paying attention will still find some way to make sure you're never left standing alone in the wreckage, even if you don't fully understand their reasons, until long after they are already gone. Have you ever discovered a hidden truth about someone you trusted completely? Something that quietly rearranged everything you thought you understood about your own family? How did you first find it? And how did you handle it once you finally knew? Tell me about it in the comments below. If you believe that quiet, careful people are sometimes the ones protecting you the most, even when it looks, on the surface, like they've said absolutely nothing at all, hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.